Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back from the summer break. You might be asking yourself, where did you go on summer break? Did you take a nice vacation there, Curious John? I took a lovely vacation to the world of COVID. And due to COVID, which wasn't honestly as bad as it could have been, I suppose. You had a little bit of that brain fog post COVID, and there's also a lack of motivation, and so that's why there hasn't been a podcast in a while. Plus, as I continue to say nearly every single episode, I'm incredibly busy, and it's just really hard to find the time to kind of get this podcast recorded and in a right, succinct manner. Additionally, I also, well, let's backtrack. To give you an example, I'm recording this podcast like on a weekend when I actually find a little bit of quiet time, find the right topic and the right mindset to kind of get myself ready for this. But in addition to that, I also have to now edit another podcast and prep that for the coming week. So it's just never-ending fun on this side of the world. But I guess this week's topic, I want to elaborate a little bit more about a topic I've covered probably more than any other topic on this podcast, and that's the topic of more. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I have 2-3 podcasts on this already. It's essentially the idea that you can always do more, you can always achieve more, you can always set your goals higher, you can always do more than you ever think you can. And with that, I've covered it a number of different times. The first podcast was, presenting the idea of more. The second podcast was giving you more about the idea of the challenges that come along with that mindset. And in that podcast, I alluded to the idea that sometimes when you get yourself into a mindset in which you can do more, you can keep going, you're pushing yourself higher and higher, and that comes with a certain level of stress, right? Because you're essentially choosing to set a marker higher than you've ever set, whether that's fitness or for diet or work or school challenges, or you're taking more onto your plate. There's always a little bit more stress associated with that. And to be quite honest, overall, I do think that that is what has led to my quote-unquote COVID situation. Right? One of these days, probably towards the end of the year, I'll elaborate a little bit on what my year has been like. It's been probably one of the most challenging and difficult years I've had in quite a while for a number of different reasons. But in some respects, it's also been somewhat rewarding based on what I'm able to achieve. Pros and cons, right? Yin and yang. With that said, there is stress releases cortisol. It's a stress hormone. And when cortisol is all around your body, it becomes something where inflammation and your immune system tends to weaken. And I do feel like I survived the quote-unquote COVID years, the heavy COVID years, with really no issues. I never had COVID before up until now, unless I just powered through it and I was unaware of it. But I do think that the culmination of consistently doing what I'm doing and taking on what I've been taking on for the last year now has developed a situation in which the thing finally got to me. It finally got to me, and my body kind of didn't do the best job at protecting me from sickness. That is my rolling theory at the moment. And as I sit here and I'm fully recovered, I'm fine now, I'm back to work, I'm doing my thing, I'm back into the swing of things, 100%. I think through a little bit because that's my nature. My nature is to kind of think about greater concepts and try to distill them and get something out of it. And when I come to this podcast and I talk to you folks about these concepts of more, right? I also want to be able to give you folks updates as to whether or not my philosophies on life have changed and whether or not they are something that needs to change for the benefit of not just myself, but also for the things I'm proposing. Because as I've mentioned a million times on this podcast, I'm not one of these self-help guru guys. I'm not trying to tell you what to do with your life. I'm telling you the things that I've done, the lessons I've learned, And whether or not you implement those in your life, that's a choice. That's a personal choice. But the things I choose to talk about and the lessons I choose to teach on this podcast are those of which that have been incredibly beneficial to me, and or things I've come across and have now kind of deeply thought about. But for the lessons, those what I call the gems, the nuggets, or whatever I call them throughout this podcast, those important ones, the work, the why, the choice, all these different ones I've talked about at different times that are incredibly beneficial to me, are things that I do want to further flush out in case there are scenarios that one needs to be cautious and aware of. And the other piece I do want to talk about as well is that although these are great lessons that I have learned and tried to implement, as we've talked about on other podcasts in the past, when you are in the proverbial box, when you're in the mindset of what you're doing at that moment, and you don't try to step out of the box mentally for a second, you never are able to get perspective and never able to implement them. And there are things that are harder to implement if they are not in your nature. Let me give you an example of what I mean. In the scenario of more, the concept of more that I've talked about a number of different times, including this podcast, the concept of more is such that you are pushing yourself further than you think you are, because your breaking point is usually mentally and biologically far further than you ever think it is. I'll give you an example. When you go running, let's say you go running, whatever shape you're in, whether you're in great shape or bad shape cardiovascularly, when you go running, there is a certain amount of time that you can go running, and then those thoughts start creeping into your head. Those thoughts of like, well, let's just take a quick little break. Or you're tired. You're getting really tired. How about we just take a couple steps and walk for like 10 seconds or whatever, and then we'll keep going. Or hey, then the thoughts get more aggressive. Then they say, hey, we're gonna, you're not feeling good. This is not great. We need to stop. And then if you keep pushing past that, then your brain really starts working hard. And runners often talk about this scenario where you need to get past that hump. And after that hump, you can just keep going and it's not as bad and it's not that big of a deal, right? They talk about, the first mile or whatever is the roughest. And then all of a sudden you find yourself running 5 miles. And that's true in life as well. We often get into situations where you feel like you can't handle the stress. You can't handle the drama. You can't handle the workload. You can't handle everything you've got going on in life. And the reality of the situation is that mentality is the equivalent of the mentality that pokes into your brain whenever you want to stop running after X amount of time. Fill in the blank. It's the same thing. And oftentimes, if you keep moving, if you keep going, if you keep stepping forward, if you keep doing what you need to be doing, you'll often get past that. And then you'll look back and you'll say, wow, I'm further into this project than I ever thought I was. Or I'm further into this drama than I ever thought I was. And I survived it and I moved on. But sometimes if you stop and take a break, you still have those miles to run. And you're going to come up to that mindset once again in the rest of those miles, the remainder of the miles. 100%. And same thing with your drama and stress. If you stop doing your work because you're stressed out and overwhelmed, and when you come back to it, it's still going to overwhelm and stress you, and you're still going to have that work done no matter what. So that's what I meant by there's always more in the tank than you think there is. You're always capable of more. You're always able to do more. There's always more you can do. There's always more energy in the tank. There's always more stress you can take on. There's always more things you can do. And that's very true. And this is kind of just a refresher for you folks that don't remember the previous podcast. But the second piece of that is once again, being aware that these things do come with stress. All the things that you're likely very proud of yourself for achieving in your life are things that were difficult, not things that came easy. And with those things came a satisfaction because they were stressful, because they were difficult. But you're always playing this tedious game of stress and functioning. And once again, when your body fails you, it's because the stress levels got way too far, and you kept going too long, and you didn't have the right approach. And that's where I kind of have to bring back another podcast, and I'm trying to remember what I named it. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it was basically the podcast where I talked about the idea that how you look at the world really affects what you take out of it. And what do I mean by that? I think I called it perspective. I'd have to go back and look at my episodes. But ultimately, I even used the running analogy at that point. I remember having a perspective because I was going on a run, and that's what gave me the motivation for that podcast episode. I remember being on a run, and I was getting towards the very end of the run. It was literally the last few, maybe the last quarter mile, if you will. And I remember running, and that those thoughts started really, really creeping in. And it's the worst when those thoughts start creeping in, but you're also exhausted, and you're also like your lungs are just having a hard time breathing, and you just feel exhausted. Your heart is pumping incredibly fast. And that's when it becomes a bit more challenging. You have to really dig into that mental toughness a little bit. But I remember in that run, I talked about making the realization that if I made it fun, if I changed my mindset from focusing on what my body was telling me was going on, if I changed my mindset and stopped thinking about what my body was telling me, and I just kept on running, kept on moving my feet, and I made a fun joke out of it, if I made a fun, exciting little game out of it, it became far more fun, and it no longer became a stressful situation. I talked about at that moment during my run that I started looking at the concrete that I was running on, and there was lines, right? There's those I think they're like brake lines. So when the concrete breaks, it'll break and go towards those lines because it's thinner in that area. And I remember looking at those lines, and then all of a sudden I'm running, and I'm trying not to touch the lines. We all played that game as children, where you're running and you're trying not to touch the lines, and you're like, I'm going to jump over that line. I'm going to get my cadence in a certain position so that every single time my step drops, it's nowhere near a line. And then as I played that game in my head for a couple of minutes, I found myself at the end of my run. And during that time, while playing that game, I wasn't worried about what my body was feeling and whether or not I'd pass out and whether or not my lungs would explode or my heart would explode. Whatever dumb things pop into your head, right? Those things weren't in my head because I was so focused on having fun and so focused on enjoying the process, right? That was that podcast. You should probably go back and listen to those if you haven't. But why am I bringing two podcasts up in this podcast? Not because I'm trying to take up space. I'm doing it to give you guys examples of how, first and foremost, although I preach some of these topics and ideas within this podcast, some of them I'm incredibly good at. Some of them I still need work at. But it doesn't change the fact that these have been incredibly useful for me, and they continue to be incredibly useful tools and helpful things that I implement on my day-to-day. So when I mention that, and once again, not a guru, not a self-help person, not a counselor, whatever. And so as I'm telling you that, I'm great at the more. Those of you that know me, know that I'm great with the more. I have that mindset where it's just like, fuck with me. Let's find out. I'm good at that, right? That's why I have a podcast called Keep That Same Fucking Energy. Because I'm good at that. That's what I'm good at. But when it comes to repurposing my brain for that fun activity so that I take maybe my job or my schooling or my other stuff and I take that and make a fun game out of it so that it's not as stressful, probably not as good at that skill as the more. For sure. And so what is my point I'm trying to tell you folks? Because I've now alluded to two different podcasts. I've now alluded to two different things that I would suggest that you go back and listen to. What am I saying? First and foremost, I want to point out the idea that I'm not perfect and I never claim to be. And even though I've dropped some nuggets and gems and diamonds or whatever we're calling them these days, even though I've dropped some of these on your lap, realize that I also sometimes falter. And as stupid as this is, like, I'm now throwing ownership into it because in some respects, what I'm trying to tell you folks is that I faltered because I didn't do what I was supposed to do, and I let too much stress build up, and that's what got me COVID. And in some weird respects, I'm taking ownership here, which is another podcast episode. But I digress. What I'm trying to essentially tell you is that I can totally see a scenario in which if I would have approached all of the things I was taking on in a different mindset, a fun mindset, a mindset where it would have not produced as much stress and cortisol in my system, there's a very good likelihood I would have never gotten COVID. I've never gotten COVID ever in my life. And so, am I kind of poo-pooing myself for getting COVID? No. But I'm taking the time to analyze the real overarching scenario and thinking about what could have happened differently, what did I do differently, what could I have done differently, because that's what I do in life, and that's where this podcast stems from. But ultimately, the lesson I'm trying to teach you folks, in addition to applying ownership of my situation, bringing you people into the fold of what's been going on the last couple of weeks, I'm trying to also explain to everybody that's listening at the moment that essentially these tools are still very, very useful if you can implement them. And I myself, while I've learned these lessons, it is also hard for myself to implement them. And so 2 things, definitely give yourself grace, right? I love that term, grace, because I don't think we often give each other enough grace, the idea of the benefit of the doubt over the choices made or the things that have occurred, right? But also the other side of that is knowing that if you're going to choose to take an approach like more, you will have to find a way to take a step back from the box, get your head out of the box, and try to implement some of the fun pieces, make it into a challenge, a fun challenge, so that the more mindset doesn't supersede you, and then there's other side effects of that, whether it's health issues or not taking care of yourself or not doing what you should be doing. And so that's kind of it, it's and along with the other stuff I mentioned before, that's kind of this week's podcast. It's a good ramp up, it's a good reminder, and I also want to remind the folks that haven't listened to the past episodes, especially those gems. I need to find a way to identify them better within the podcast list. But for those of you that haven't listened to those, and those are, for me, the greatest things you can likely take out of this podcast. Because once again, they have been that helpful for me. But I'll leave you folks with that. And I hope, once again, that you folks take this podcast and you try to take some of the themes and the concepts and the lessons, and you take a step back out of your box for a second, give yourself a good 20, 30 minutes to think about how these ideas apply to your life and how you can implement positive change in your life with some of these ideas. I urge you to think about that, because that's why I do this podcast. That's why there's no ads, there's nothing else on this podcast. It's for the idea to give you something to positively think about and potentially positively affect your life with or implement in your life for a positive result. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. Folks know how to get a hold of me. LifeGeneralist on Instagram. I have, I'm sure, contact info down below. I appreciate all you folks that listen, and we'll talk to you folks next time. I am LifeGeneralist, and this has been Curious John.